Injury is something that everyone has in one form or another, whether that be physiological, psychological, spiritual, emotional injury. We all have types of trauma that we have in our bodies from experiences, whether that be something that happened in the past, like an accident, like a trauma that comes in, or perhaps it's also training related, that over time you've invested too much in certain movement patterns have ultimately betrayed what happens if it's just repetitive and not structured within a sustainable practice, and inflammation and things like this start to occur. Now, the first thing that I must state quite clearly is that I do not have a background in physiotherapy or types of practices that are specifically dealt with rehabilitating and helping people recover from injury. On the other side of the coin, what I do have is a lot of experience of working with people who do have injury and employing certain movement tools that have helped alleviate and in many cases completely recover from types of injury. Now, there are different types of injury that we'll have to discuss, and of course are focusing on the physiological point here. If you have spiritual or emotional injury, you may need to visit someone else, or perhaps it can even be dealt with through your physical practice. However, the first thing is that we have types of injury that are movable and immovable. Now, this is a term that a friend brought to me, which I believe was mentioned to him by Odelia Goldschmidt, who works with the Ido Portal team. It's Ido's right-hand woman. And an immovable injury is something that is normally a type of trauma or something anatomical that you've perhaps been born with. And it's just the case that, no matter what you do with this thing, it's you. It is you. That's the way that it is. It doesn't go there. However, in many cases, we may believe that it's an immovable injury, an immovable blockage in the body, but you can never really say that until you've invested quite some time, and by some time I mean years, in attending to and trying to diagnose and figure out and explore what this injury is. And what you can find in many cases is that people will try one or two things for an injury from one or two perspectives, such as just a rehab perspective with bands and things. Oh, it didn't work. Doesn't work. In many cases, if you want to rehabilitate an area, you don't have to specifically go into that particular area and focus everything on that. In many cases, the body, as ultimately an organism which is completely interconnected, if you start practicing something else that is not normally in your movement habits, let's say for example you have some lumbar spine issues, and then you start practicing hanging. You've done all this stuff previously with rolling the back and twisting and certain stretches and things, and it just doesn't work. And then you start doing hanging, which is something you never did before. And suddenly you start to feel decompression in your spine, and over time, it starts to disappear. And this back pain you had, which perhaps a doctor told you was due to a particular disc or something that, here, there, and everything else, turns out that a lot of alleviation can be given from hanging. So now what your job would be is to invest even more in that over years and then truly see, is it something that's immovable or is it something that's movable? So that brings us to movable injuries. And in many cases, movable injuries are things that have not always occurred through a specific trauma or something that's anatomical, but it's something that is related to movement habits. So, for example, if you're suffering from certain inflammation or impingement in the shoulders, hip things, and many common types of superficial back pain, in these cases, it's likely that they are due to your movement habits, and what you can find is as soon as you start investing in different and more varied movement habits and stepping away from the habitual practice of these other things, it will start to be moved out of your body, these types of injuries. This is not to say that they won't return. They can return in many shapes and forms. And this is why I want to bring back to the perspective of injuries being the stories of you. Injuries are the stories of you. They are you. One very detrimental thing that can happen is when you develop a negative relationship with an injury that you have. You don't need to hate your injuries. You don't need to feel guilty about your injuries. You don't need to feel guilty about the mistakes or things that you make in your past, as long as you are doing something to rectify them and you realize it and you are working towards bettering them. Ultimately, these are the experiences that you grow from. I have learned the most in my movement practice from my injuries. It's taught me the most. And I'm not just talking about protocols and different tools that I've then been able to share with people that have helped them, although this has been hugely beneficial. I'm talking more about the psychology of practice and my relationship with physical practice. When you've met those times when you felt yourself so injured that, I feel so down because I can't do anything. Yeah, there's plenty of stuff you can do. You just need to think harder and start practicing some different stuff and accept and incorporate those things into your movement practice. Anyone, even if you have no arms and no legs, you can balance a stick on your head. It just depends if you have the psychological acceptance or perspective to accept that and incorporate that into your movement practice and to find the value of it and practice it. So, with regards to injury, we will focus on those particular points that you have injury, but keep in mind that injury is something that must be explored if it is to be understood. In many cases, we don't really fully understand our injuries. We know that it hurts in a certain place and when I do a certain thing, but what that can often lead to is, it hurts with back squats, so I don't do any type of anything to do. This is very common. I don't do anything that involves this. So, okay, well, how do you do it? Of course, maybe you need to avoid back squat with body weight, a body weight and a half, but are there other types of squats that will teach you something and help move this area? Because ultimately what we want to do with your injuries is move them. I've spoke about blockages already, and an injury is essentially a blockage of energy. In one way or another, it has culminated into a point where it's become blocked, or a blockage has been put there and now energy is being blocked and it needs a release. And it can only release with movement. The way to approach this is sensitively, but definitely. You have to visit these places, you have to realize the textures, you have to sometimes take it a little too far so this is the edge that I'm working on. And ultimately, if you have an injury that's here, we want to work around it, explore around it until it kind of gets mapped. And my body starts to understand it. It's like, actually, no, we know this a bit more, and the spot gets smaller, it gets smaller, it gets smaller, it gets smaller. And then, it ultimately dissipates. It becomes smaller. And then I've mapped this area. I've brought more experience and movement to this area, so my nervous system is more comfortable with it. My nervous system doesn't have certain responses that translate into pain and discomfort, and then psychological things such as, I shouldn't do this, such as tension being developed and all these reciprocal processes happening. So when you have injury, first of all, we explore and be mindful that it may release things you weren't even aware was there. Whether that be emotional things or perhaps other pains that are associated to it. And one thing that can very often happen, and I'll use hanging as an example again, is that when you're hanging, you start to decompress the spine. In many cases, people will find things there that they didn't realize were there. Story from, I used to have worked in many CrossFit gyms and many different places. And I prescribed hanging very often, as I do, and there was one really big guy who was a coach actually, and He never hung. He could throw weights over his head. He never did hanging. And then we did some hanging. And as soon as he took his feet off the floor, he just went, ah! And had to put his feet on the floor. And he was like, ah, my shoulder. I was like, man, you didn't even know that was there. One of the responses to this can often be, yeah, I don't do hanging stuff. It's bad for my shoulder. Is it bad for your shoulder? No, your shoulder is bad for its shoulder at the moment. So when you start to unlock these doors in your house that you didn't even know were locked, to use another analogy from Ido Portal, when you start to discover these closed doors in your house because the programming will be taking you to these places, and you unlock, and then it's like the scene from The Shining when you open the elevator doors and all the blood comes out gushing and you're like, oh my God, I didn't know this was there. Take it as something well valuably learned. Learn from it, accept it, that this position needs more attention, it needs more love, it needs more movement, and get to work. Over time, there will be changes because your movement habits are changing. However, you may still find it's not progressing in the way that you might like. Well, first of all, I would say, of course, everyone's way that they might like is complete rehabilitation of the affected area, but I'll return to what I said previously. In some cases, this will never happen. I have movements that at this point in time I simply do not do, even though I did them in the past, because I'm still carrying injuries from certain traumas that I've had, that it would just be stupid for me to do so. I would put myself in a position where psychologically and physiologically I'm not ready to be doing that. Some things I have to accept that are most likely going to be with me for the rest of my life, so I just don't even pursue certain journeys that other people might, because I know I'm just going to be asking for trouble, because that's not where my physiological allowances lie at this point in time. However, perhaps I've only been exploring these things for 3 or 4 years. How do I know what my physiology is going to allow with the practice that I'm doing in 5 years' time? The classic phrase is people overestimate what they can do in 1 year, and they underestimate what they can do in 5 years. 5 years, you can completely change the anatomy of your body in places where you thought were completely blocked. So it's an ongoing process. To recap about injury: movable injuries and immovable injuries. Your practice will reveal both, and it will also reveal perhaps things you thought were immovable are actually movable, and over time it might require you to accept that certain things at this point in time are unavailable to you, and certain journeys should not be undertaken given the current restrictions in place. The movements that you'll be programmed and the types of rehabilitation routines are designed to give more experience to those areas so that they start to understand themselves, and you understand that in this position more, what is available, what is not available, and to start mapping it a bit more so your body can learn certain allowances it might be able to give you. For example, if it's something that's related to tension held because of neurological effects, or if it's actually something anatomical that's just not going to budge anytime soon with the current body that you have. Lastly, I would just like to reiterate, do not hate your injuries. Do not, or at least try to move away from the feelings that get you down when you have injuries. These are movement projects. These are your movement projects in themselves. Just like trying to learn a helicoptero or a muscle up or a handstand. These are movement projects, so are working on these things that are a part of you.